Okay, Boker Tov. Today's daf is Mem Vav, and we pick up on the bottom of Mem Hamud Bet, and our discussion is that the Mishnah speaks about somebody falling asleep, and if you're not conscious, can you establish that as the place of your Eruv? According to Rabbi Yochanan ben Nuri, you can. According to the Chachamim, you cannot. Interestingly, according to the Chachamim, if you cannot, so where is the place of your Eruv? So the Mishnah gives you the same status as if you had gone out of the Tchum. You're not in any particular place. You only have your 4 amot. Some of the Rishonim ask, why is that different than like the case we see later in the Gemara about the rain that falls on Shabbos, or the boat that lands on Shabbos when it was higher than 10 tefachim, that at least it can get 2,000 amos from where it lands. But here they're not so lenient. They say, well, there it wasn't yet in the zone. Here you're in the zone and you just weren't conscious. Anyway, it's not so clear. But if you didn't have that place, then you're left with 4 amot, and that's the debate. And the Gemara says maybe it's not just maybe it's not about a person who's not conscious. Maybe it even goes deeper. Maybe it would even be about inanimate objects. And that then becomes the question whether inanimate objects that normally follow their owner, but if they are ownerless, are they defined as the place where they began Shabbos 2,000 amot, or does it go by the person who finds them? So, by analogy, or similarly, a person who's unconscious, does he establish his place 2,000 amot, or does he not have a place for Shabbat and is limited to 4 amot? So now the Gemara continues with this, and it says the following. He also coming to Rav Yosef. So the line starts with the word Rav Yosef. It's on Mem Hamud Bet. It's about 12 lines from the bottom, maybe 15 lines from the bottom. Starts the word from Rav Yosef. So this was Abaye who was telling over this whole discussion about whether you go based on the whole Braitas about rain and where the rain lands and so on. That if that rain that fell before Shabbos is defined by where it fell. That's the idea that Cheftzei Hefker, not owned objects, are Kona Shvisa, define their Shabbos to begin where they are. And that's being made as parallel to the position of Rabbi Yochanan ben Nuri. So now it says like this. Ki also coming to Rav Yosef, when Abai came to Rav Yosef, Amalei, Hachi Kama Rav Safra, this is what Rav Safra said, V'hachi Ahadar lei, and this is what I responded to him. So, I'm sorry, we read that already. I'm sorry, we pick up later down. About 8 lines from the bottom with the 2 dots, Amar Mar. The line starts with the word lei. Okay, so Amar Mar, B'Yom Tov Harehin Karagli Kol Adam. So this is the case that if the rain fell on Yom Tov, so obviously its place wasn't established on when Yom Tov began, when it was on the ground, so then it does not have any particular place, and it's defined by the person who finds them. Harehin Karagli Kol Adam. So the Gemara says, Ve'amai, why is this true? Likni here. Got to get more tape. My little whole jury-rigged contraption is having problems. Okay. Anyway, Ramai Likni Likni Shvisa B'Ukainis. Why doesn't it acquire its Shabbos? Meaning its time. Why doesn't it acquire where it rests, where it begins Shabbos in the ocean? You see the word Ukainis and ocean, right? If you make the K into a C. No, they mean whatever ocean it began in. I mean, they sort of believed that the that there was like one huge ocean that surrounded everything. So anyway, all right, I'm not sure. Anyway, so let it start Shabbos. Fine, we'll use that if we need to. Let it start Shabbos in the ocean. Meaning, where was it when Shabbos began? When Shabbos began, it was in the ocean. So why don't we say that that's where it gets its 2,000 amot from the ocean, and then based on the water cycle, and it evaporates and it comes back down, and it's outside of its 2,000 amot, and you can't use the rain at all. So why don't we say that? So the Gemara says, Lema delok Rabbi Eliezer. Let's say this contradicts Rabbi Eliezer. The Eiruvin Rabbi Eliezer was like Rabbi Eliezer. Ha'amar kolam kulam imei ukainis who shows that. He says the whole world drinks from the water of ukainis. Meaning, again, I think this was an understanding that basically it was one ocean. So based on the water cycle, all water eventually comes from that ocean. And the Gemara assumes that it happens within 24 hours. So anything that's raining on Shabbos, Erev Shabbos, it started in the ocean.
They assumed rainwater came from the ocean.
Yes.
Why would they say
I know. Yeah, right, because, yeah, so that's why it's quoting Rav Yosef, who was of that, Rabbi Eliezer, who's of that opinion. So it's saying maybe this proves not like Rabbi Eliezer, that the water comes from elsewhere than the ocean. So let's take a look what the Gemara says. But the basic point is, why don't we say it starts Shabbos, if assuming it was on the ground before Shabbos began and it evaporated afterwards? So the Gemara says, it's funny also the whole idea that you consider it the same object after the whole process of evaporation and condensation and so on. So the Gemara says, Amar of Yitzchak, Hacha ba'avim shenis kashumer of Yontav askinan. It didn't evaporate on Yontiv. The clouds were already darkened before Yontiv began, so you knew the water was already up in the clouds when Yontiv was beginning. And it wasn't on the ground, and it wasn't Konesh Shvisa. So the Gemara says, so okay, but how do you know that it was the dark clouds that rained on Yontiv? Maybe those dark clouds blew away, and the rain came from other clouds from water that had just recently evaporated. So the Gemara says, the Islu Simana B'Gavayu. You have a simon on it, like, you have a name tag on the cloud or something. So oh yeah, because it was the cloud that looked like the bunny rabbit, so it's the same cloud. Okay, Ina, the Gemara then has a better answer. The Baisema, if you want, I can say, how he suffix to Divrei. Okay, we don't know. Maybe it came from the cloud that had already had the evaporated water in it. Maybe it came from water that evaporated on Yontiv itself. So it's a question about a rabbinic law, because this whole idea of Tchumim is rabbinic. The suffix to Divrei L'Hakel, and therefore you can be lenient. So basically, the Gemara says, maybe this water was on the ground when Yontiv began. It says, we don't know, so it's a suffix, so it's suffix l'kula. So now the Gemara says, okay, let's assume it was in the clouds when Yontif began. Why doesn't it establish Shabbos in the clouds? Why isn't that determine its tchum? So tifshot minei, let's learn from this, right? The ein tchumim l'maylam yasara, that the reason we don't say that that it goes from 2,000 amot from the clouds is because there's no tchumim higher than 10 tfachim. The yesh tchumim likni shvisa ba'avim. If there is tchumim, let it sort of establish its place up in the clouds. So the Gemara says, at least this is better than like Elio descending from the clouds. It's the rain descending from there. So it says, I will tell you really that we do tchumim even not on the ground. So why isn't the water considered to have its tchum based in the clouds? The water is absorbed in the clouds. It doesn't yet exist. So therefore, it doesn't exist before it rained. It's sort of seen as part of the cloud. It's only vapor. So therefore, there's no tchum for that water. So the Gemara says, and now this is the question everybody was asking at the end of yesterday, so then it should certainly be a problem. Forget tchum. If it doesn't really exist, it should be nolad. So the asiri that it's forbidden. The Gemara says, fine, you're right. So the water, it's not like it completely doesn't exist, like it's completely absorbed. It's there in the cloud, but it's not stationary. It's floating around as water vapor, and therefore you're not kona shvisa in something that is completely non-stationary. Now, by the way, this idea that rain is not considered to be muktzah, is not considered to be nolad, is quite fascinating, because in general we go pretty crazy about what we consider to be nolad. Like we say, like there's some opinions that basically, if you make ice, that's nolad, even though the water is there and you're just like changing, the state of it, or from ice to water is nolad. And nevertheless, rain isn't muktzah, isn't nolad, snow isn't nolad. So I mean, okay, you could explain that, but then we should have much more, lax definitions of nolad under other circumstances. Anyway, so the Gemara says it's not nolad, and it's not an issue about being konesh shvisa, starting its place in the clouds, because it's moving. And moving, you don't have a fixed space. So
what we said about a boat.
So the Gemara is going to say, you mean about above 10 tefachim, you also have the fact that it's moving. So the Gemara is essentially going to say that here, right? And you're right, that actually is a good point. That would be relevant, therefore, to a boat even within 10 tefachim, if it's if it's moving and hasn't docked. And the Gemara is essentially going to say that here about water. So the Gemara says, Hashadasi slahachi, now that you've came upon this answer, ukainis nami don't be bothered even assuming it started in the ocean, the water. Maya bukainis nami miyanai, the water in the ocean person is also moving. So now we have a new idea that if something is moving when Shabbos begins, it's not defined as establishing its place. The Tanya, we taught in Brisa, Naharos HaMoshchinu Mayaros HaNovim, rivers that are running and wells that are also flowing. Harein Karagli Kol Adam. They do not go by where the water was when Shabbos began. They go by where they are when you take the water out of them, because they're not Kona Shvisa. They have no particular place for Shabbos, so they will only be defined once you took possession of them. I should say, in the case if you're on the boat, now as Dov points out, bracketing the whole issue of 10 Tvachim, if you're moving, it's not an issue, but you're not Kona Shvisa, but presumably, once you stop, then it would be defined by where you stop. Yes?
So there's a side issue that you probably don't want to discuss now, but who owns a flowing stream or river?
Well, that's assuming that it is ownerless, and that's why it's like Heftzei Hefker. But as soon as you take possession of it, you draw water from it on Shabbos, then it becomes yours, and your objects are defined by your tchum. Unless this has already established its own tchum, which we're saying it would not, because it's flowing. Okay, so now the Gemara says like this: Amar Rav Yaakov Bar Idi, Amar Rav Yoshua ben Levi, Halacha Rabbi Yochanan ben Nuri. We rule like Rabbi Yochanan ben Nuri that if you are asleep, your Shabbos begins where you fell asleep, and you have 2,000 amot, and you're not like somebody who was deposited chutz l'tchum and you only have four amot. Amalei Rabbi Zer, Rabbi Yaakov Bar Idi. So Rabbi Zer said to Rabbi Yaakov Bar Idi, "Beferish milcha." When you quoted this in the name of Rabbi Yoshua ben Levi, did he tell it to you explicitly, or michlolish milcha, or did you infer it from something he said? Amalei beferish mili. No, I heard it from him explicitly that we rule like Rabbi Yochanan ben Nuri. So the Gemara says, now why do you ask the question? Did you infer it? Because my klola, what would that general statement have been that you might have thought that he inferred it from? That you bothered asking, was it inferred or said explicitly? Because here's a statement that Rabbi Yoshua ben Levi made. Da'amar Rabbi Yoshua ben Levi, halacha k'divya mekel be'erev. We rule like the lean position in Erev. So he said maybe he didn't tell you explicitly we rule like Rabbi Yochanan ben Nuri, but there's a general statement we go by the lenient position in Erev, and therefore you figured, oh, okay, so applying that here, that would mean we go like Rabbi Yochanan ben Nuri. And he said, no. He might have made that general statement, but he also said explicitly we rule like Rabbi Yochanan ben Nuri. Right? You realize why Rabbi Yochanan ben Nuri is lenient, because according to the Chamim you only have 4 amot. Rabbi Yochanan ben Nuri says even if you fell asleep you have 2,000 amot in every direction. So now the Gemara is going to say, why did he need to say both statements? So the Tarki Lamali, why did Rav Yaakov Bar Idi say both statements? We always go by the leading position in Erev, and he said we rule like Rabbi Yochanan ben Nuri. Amar Rabbi Zera Tzrichi had to tell me both statements. The Yashmin Olach Rabbi Yochanan ben Nuri had he just said we rule like Rabbi Yochanan ben Nuri. Havamina bein lekula bein lechumra. Even when Rabbi Yochanan ben Nuri is strict. When would Rabbi Yochanan ben Nuri be strict? Remember the Gemara before said that Rabbi Yochanan ben Nuri might be based on the position that inanimate objects are kona shvisa where they begin Shabbos or Yantev, right? And the sleeping person is like the inanimate object. But that generally is a strict position, because that means they're limited from a 2,000 amos radius of where they began Shabbos, as opposed to the more lenient position that says that an inanimate object is defined by the person who finds it. Well, if I found the object, I want to be able to carry it within the space that I can go. I don't want it to be defined by some different zone. So Rabbi Yochanan ben Nuri's idea applied to inanimate objects would actually be a stringency. So had he just said we rule like Rabbi Yochanan ben Nuri, you would have said not only by sleeping people, but even by inanimate objects, even l'chumra. Kamash Milan, halacha k'divya mekel be'erev. So that's saying we go lenient both ways. By a sleeping person, we go like Rabbi Yochanan ben Nuri, and it's where you fell asleep, 2,000 amot rather than 4 amot. And by an inanimate object, it doesn't start Shabbos where it began. It's based on the person who finds it. Now, Rashi and Tosfos are both bothered, because you remember, actually, in this Masechet, towards the way earlier we said, that you can't go by 2 contradictory kula positions, right? So make up your mind. Either you paskin, inanimate objects are defined by where they begin, or you paskin they're not. How can you be paskin the lenient position both ways? By a person, we'll say it does begin where it starts. By an object, we'll say it won't. Okay, so Rashi and Tosfos will say in this statement, the Gemara is going back to what it suggested yesterday, that Rabbi Yochanan ben Nuri's position is not based on the idea of inanimate objects. Rabbi Yochanan ben Nuri's position is that because since you're a person, were you awake, Shabbos you would be kona shvisa where you are, even when you're you're asleep, it works. But if you're an inanimate object, that's categorically different. There, maybe even Rabbi Yochanan ben Nuri would say it is not defined, where it starts Shabbat. Okay, so it's not necessarily a contradictory psak. So we're lenient both ways. For the person, we say he is defined where he was, even when he was asleep. But for an object, not. An object is defined by the person who finds it. Okay, so that's why he has to tell me halacha kedivrei hameko be'erev. And not straight Rabbi Yochanan ben Nuri. We're white bein luchom. Kamash malon halacha kedivrei hameko be'erev. The lema halacha kedivrei hameko be'erev. So let's say that we always take the lenient position by erev. Halacha Rabbi Yochanan ben Nuri lamali. Why did you bother saying we rule like Rabbi Yochanan ben Nuri? Right? We could have just figured out. We go by the lenient position. So here, by the guy falling asleep, we'll say that like Rabbi Yochanan ben Nuri. No, it's trich. You needed to tell me explicitly we go by Rabbi Yochanan ben Nuri. Sagdai techamina, I would have thought to say, Hani mili, when is it true you go by the lenient position? Yachid b'makom yachid v'rab b'makom rabim. If it is an equal debate, it's one against one or many against many. So there, if both sides are equal, for Erev halachos we'll rule leniently. But if it's one against many, like Rabbi Yochanan ben Nuri is up against the Chachamim, which presumably is multiple opinions, so Amalo, maybe this rule of going by the lenient opinion would not apply. So therefore, you had to tell me, no, it even applies in this case, and we go like Rabbi Yochanan ben Nuri. Okay, so now that's all very fascinating, but it also is it has a broad relevance outside of this case. It says that for all of Hilchos Eiruvin, pretty much everything we're going to be learning, we pretty much always adopt the lenient position, even in an uneven fight. Even in one against many, we always go by the lenient position. We're going to see at the bottom of the daf. There's one other place, or one other, significant other place in which we say this as well, which we always adopt the lenient position, maybe even if it's an uneven fight, and that's by avelos. We say halach kedivi hamekel ba'avel, okay, and halach kedivi hamekel be'erev. And what this Gemara is saying is that's not just because we say it's d'Rabbanan, so we'll be mekel. It's even in a case where normal rules would tell you to be machmir, like one against many, and you would normally rule like the majority. Okay, and that's what we're saying here, and that's why he pointed it out, even in the case of Rabbi Yochanan ben Nuri, even one against many. Now the Gemara is going to develop exactly that point. Let's take a look. Amalei Rabbi Abaye. So Rabbi said to Abaye, okay, Michti. 1 minute. Let's take a look here. Eiruvin Rabbanan. So Eiruvin is rabbinic. Mali Yachid b'makom Yachid. Mali Yachid b'makom Rabbim. He didn't think this was a chiddush. If it's rabbinic, you should always be lenient, even one against many. Okay, which is a fascinating idea. So the other, so here the Papa is going to correct him. Amalei Rava. So Rabbi Papa said back to him, excuse me, the Rava. You mean to say that you think in rabbinic matters it doesn't matter one against one and one against many? We're always lenient in all rabbinic matters. It's not a special thing here by Erev. The Hatznan, I'll give you an example. We taught in the Mishnah. This is by Nida, and by Nida there's a question about the status of a woman who's hit menopause. Zakena, an elderly woman is the halachic definition, how you define that, whatever. And then it says once that woman is older and she goes 3 periods, 90 days without having her period, without bleeding, she is considered to be misuleket damim, somebody who is blood is she's no longer a woman that normally gets her period, and that has various relevance for halachot, that you don't have to be concerned that she's bled, even if she bleeds, you don't have to be concerned that she might have been bleeding earlier. You assume it's only when she actually saw it, because in general you assume, because this has a lot of relevance not just for need as we practice it, for husband and wife having sex. It has relevance for if she handled truma, when do you assume she became tameh. So if you're in a status of misuleket damim, removed of blood, you basically have none of those concerns. So when is that? That's if she was older, and what's going to happen? She was older, it's okay, and she went 90 days without bleeding. Now then there's the position of Rabbi Eliezer, who says, even if she's not older, any woman who went 90 days without bleeding gets into that category, okay? So the Gemara says, I'm sorry, so the Gemara, it's one of those days. So the Gemara, you got some tape there? Good man. Okay, so the Gemara says, okay, that's going to fall again. So the, okay, where are we? There we go. So, thank you. So the Gemara says like this. So the Gemara says, Vatnan, Rabbi Eliezer Omer, Rabbi Eliezer says, Kol isha she'avra la shlosha not, any woman, not only an older woman, who 3 periods, 90 days went, dayashat, if she finds blood, she can assume it happened just now, and she doesn't have to be concerned that she had bled earlier. Okay, Vitanya, so that's a lenient position, and that's, thank you, Yachi b'makom rabim, because he's a single opinion against the majority position of the Chachamim. Vitanya, we taught in the Brisa, Ma'isa v'asa Rebbe to Rabbi Eliezer. There was a case that Rebbe ruled like Rabbi Eliezer. A woman was not older, but she went 3 months without bleeding, and she had handled some truma, and he said, no problem. He ruled like Rabbi Eliezer. After he remembered, we'll see in a minute what he remembered, Amar, Kedai Rabbi Eliezer lismach lav b'shas adchak. We can rely on Rabbi Eliezer, even though he's a das yachid. We can rely on him because it was a case of exigency. Rashi says it was a period of famine. Actually, if it's a period of famine, you understand maybe why she didn't have her period, right? Because malnutrition is a reason for women to stop getting their period. Anyway, so therefore, Tosfos just says that she had handled a lot of truma, and it would have been a very big loss. Okay, so that's an important position about relying on a das yachid b'shas hadachak. Very important halachic position. Today's daf, really, beyond its local discussions about Eruv, are very important in terms of like psak parameters. Okay, so Rebbe said, okay, he was a das yachid, but we could rely on him b'shas hadachak. What does it mean he remembered? What did he remember he did wrong? Was he thinking, and why was he sort of disturbed? Maybe he remembered that the halacha is not like Rabbi Eliezer, but rather like the Rabbanan. So b'shas hadchak, how did he rule like him b'shas hadchak? He stops being a das yachid. Now this is a very important question in halacha. We say you can rule like a das yachid b'shas hadchak. So first of all, there's questions. Does that mean only on Rabbanans? Can we even rule like a das yachid on Doraisas b'shas hadchak? But the other very important question is, what constitutes a das yachid? And that's a question in 2 ways. Number one is, let's say some weird guy you never heard of once said this idea. Is that a das yachid? How weighty does the position have to be? But then there's another question. Even if it started off as a weighty position, when does it stop being an active position? When has psak basically said this no longer exists as even as a minority position? So this actually is related to the quote-unquote, or the question of the canonization of the Shulchan Aruch. You realize when the Shulchan Aruch first came out, it was one opinion among many, and it was over a period of time that it became more and more authoritative. So one of the sort of areas where you see this is a question of, can you rule like a Shita in the Rishonim if it's sort of not in the Shulchan Aruch? Does it continue to be a Das Yachid? So this is a very important question. At what time is it something considered to be, this stops being a voice? So that's what the Gemara says. If we had ruled explicitly like the Rabbanan, you would never be able to use Rabbi Eliezer, even b'shas hadchak. 1 minute. So therefore, what was his issue? Why was he think I should have gone like the rabbis, but I can rely on Rabbi Eliezer? So it says, Elo, to lo itmar, hilchasa lo Rabbi Eliezer lo Rabbanan. We hadn't explicitly ruled either way. But la'achar sheniskar, so what did he remember and that he had done wrong or made a mistake? The lav yachi paligalei el rabin paligalei. He realized, look, we haven't explicitly ruled, but the normal sort of rules of psak should have made me rule like the rabbis, because they're the rabin, they're the majority against a single opinion. So it's not like Rabbi Eliezer's position has been completely rejected, but normal psak rules I should have ruled like the rabbis. Okay, but nevertheless. Amar Kedai Rabbi Eliezer lismach b'shas hadchak. I can rely on Rabbi Eliezer because it is a shas hadchak. So this becomes a very important principle that if a das yachid is not completely, silenced, if it's not like we absolutely rule this way, the other position is completely rejected. If it's not seen as completely silenced, then b'shas hadchak, you can rely on it. There are these questions, I said, is it only in rabbinic matters, even in biblical matters? There's a lot of literature about what are those parameters. Rav Kook has a long discussion about it in his whole introduction to V'shav Sa'aretz, his book about Shemitah, because in his introduction he lays the groundwork for the whole idea of Heter Mechira, and he wants to sort of say, can you rely on the various Shitot that we can do Mechiras, Eretz Yisrael Bizman Hazeh, that will work to deal with issues of Shemitah, etc., and he has a whole discussion of the parameters of relying on a Das Yachid, B'shas Hadachak. So in terms of this Gemara, the argument was, look, you see that even by rabbinic matters, like this issue was, that we say that if it's many against one, you rule like the many. Right? We don't say if it's rabbinic matters, we normally always go by every lenient opinion. We would rule by the majority over a single opinion. So it really matters. So it really is a chiddush to say that by Eiruvin, we're going to rule like a minority opinion, even in the face of many. Yes, Charlie.
So two issues. I mean, one is what about when the Shulchan Aruch? This is go to your application.
Yeah.
When the Shulchan Aruch goes by a minority opinion on the Rishon, and the second, what if there's a Rishon the author of Shulchan Aruch didn't even know about such a theory?
Okay, so those are all good questions, which I'm not going to answer. Okay, so now the Gemara says like this. Okay. Yeah.
Who determines what's a shas adchak and when does it stop? And then there's the whole to revert back.
Well, okay, so that's a good point. Who determines what's a shas adchak? That's the sort of, that's the responsibility of every rabbi, and that's why it matters like which posek you go to, because it's not like a science. It's an art, and there's a lot of judgment, and all these issues. Is this still considered a legitimate das yachid? Or does it stop being a das yachid? Is this a legitimate shas adchak? Right? All of those are judgment calls that the posek makes. I mean, obviously informed by precedent and literature and so on, but ultimately there's contradictory evidence around all of this, and it's going to be a lot of this is going to be a judgment call. The second question you ask is an excellent one, which is yes, there's a difference between having sort of the black letter law and then understanding a latitude that you have in exceptional cases, and as opposed to changing the codified law. So if you say, really the law is X, but there are other opinions out there that you can rely on, b'shas adchak is a very different type of a move than saying we're actually going to, change the law based on those opinions, which is those that don't like Heter Mechira, that's one of their arguments. They say, well, Rav Kook only said it was because of Shas HaDchak. So if we say it's no longer Shas HaDchak, it goes back to saying we shouldn't rely on those positions. All right, so anyway, let's take a look now as the Gemara continues. I'm Rav Misharshia the Rav. So Rav Misharshia said, again, back to Rav, who said, what's a big chiddush? And everybody's saying, what do you mean? It's a big chiddush that normally, even by rabbinic matters, you would go by the majority. So he's going to say the same thing. Or some say Rav Nachman bar Yitzchak said to Rabbi, but Rabbanan lo shani ben Yachid b'makom Rabbi, Yachid ben Yachid b'makom Rabbi. You think it doesn't matter by all rabbinic laws that we would go by the, by the lenient, even a single opinion against a majority? V'hatani we turn the brayso. Shmua krova. If somebody hears that an immediate relative passed away, and they hear it in the recent aftermath, which means within 30 days of the death, no heges shiva shloshim. That person does the nihugim of shiva and 30 days and the shloshim. V'choka, if it was if he heard about it a long time later, which is after 30 days, there's only one day of avelus that person keeps. What's the difference between near and far? Recent and far in the past. Within 30 days is near, after is far. That's Rabbi Akiva's position. The Chachamim and the sages say, whether it's a recent report or an old report, no heges shiva shloshim. You do shiva shloshim. So again, it's Rabbi Akiva against a majority opinion. And what's the psak? Whenever you find an individual that's meko and a majority that's machmir, you go by the majority. It would have been interesting to hear him say the opposite, right? That even if the machmirim are meko. But anyway, the general rule is we go. But maybe the point is, even though it's Rabbanan, and we would normally maybe go by the lenient position, you go by the majority position, even if they're the machmir one. This case of Shmua Krov is an exception. Even though Rabbi Akiva is lenient and the rabbis are machmir, and there's a majority opinion, we go like Rabbi Akiva. Now, why is that? Why is it violating the rule that we're going by a das yachid? By avelus, we go like the lenient position. By avelus is when the rabbis were lenient. It's a special exception. But the normal rule we see being expressed in this braita said, what should the normal rule have been? You go like the majority. Even by rabbinic law, shani ben yachid ben yachid ben yachid b'makom rabim. It makes a difference whether it's one against one or one against many. So this basically is a very important Gemara, and it basically said the following. There's an idea that you go by the lenient position by D'Rabbanans, okay, but the general rule would be that all other things being equal. First of all, if you learn the sugya and you're persuaded that one position is right, you paskin that way. But let's say there's equal, that you don't know how to paskin, so then okay, you go by the lean position, but that's only if other things are equal. If it's minority position against majority, you would rule like the majority. That's the general rule by D'Rabbanans. There are two exceptions to it. Halacha kedivi hamekel be'eruv, and halacha kedivi hamekel be'avel. And in Eiruvin and Avelos, quite interesting, right? Those two big areas, based on the Gemara, it's not exactly clear why those are such exceptions, but those areas are ones in which we always adopt the lenient position, even, presumably, it's one against many. And that is the chiddush that is being said here. Okay, so now let's see where the Gemara goes with this. Yes, and of course to remember that the important point about, that we also said in passing, that even when you paskin like the majority, if a certain position has not completely been rejected, then, you can be somech on it b'shas adchak, which is a really regular and critical part of paskining halacha. Yes?
I have a friend who was adopted, and when her father died, they didn't let her sit shiva or anything.
Yeah, that's a different issue. That's not Shmuel Krova or Rechoka. That has to do with, whether you sit shiva for an adoptive parent, because it's not biological parent and so on. That's a separate conversation. Right.
If there's a...
Well, that's an issue, because when you say mekil, for some people, meaning to make it would be easier for them if you would let them sit shiva, So that's an interesting for how you define mekil by avelus. It's defined as demanding less of you, but what about allowing you? And they're actually, most, I would say, sympathetic poskim will say that even if you're not technically chayiv to sit for an adoptive parent, that you're allowed to sit, or they, make certain ways to make a distinction between the normal sitting of shiva, but basically, so that's also, the most makil is to give you the option, if you think about it that way, yeah. All right, so anyway, so let's take a look at, as the Gemara continues. Rav Papa Amar, now back to this question. So that was all one approach. Why did you need to tell me we were like Rabbi Yochanan ben Nuri? Because even though it was Erev and D'Rabbanan, he was a Yachid b'makom rabim. For Rav Papa Amar, it's true. You needed to tell me both things. We go l'kula all the time, and we were like Rabbi Yochanan ben Nuri. I would have thought Hani mili be'erev chatzeros. Maybe when are we lenient by erev chatzeros? Maybe this rule you're always lenient won't apply to erev tchumim. Tzricha, you need to tell me both. What would have let me think that there would be a difference? Now, the easiest thing to say is that eruv tchumim are connected to a D'Oraisa concept, right? According to some, there's an aspect of it that's D'Oraisa, but that's not what the Gemara says. Tetnan. Amar Rav Yehuda. When is it that you can not do an erev for somebody? By erev tchumim, I can't go say, I'm going to be nice. I'm going to make Charlie's Erev Tchumim, 2,000 amos out the city. Obviously, I can't do that. Who says Charlie? That means that Charlie can travel more in that direction, but less in the other direction. So I can't do it on his behalf without his knowledge. It's hurting him. So when is that true? That's true about Erev Tchumim. If Charlie and I are all part of a courtyard here, and we want to do an Erev Chatzeros to carry in the courtyard, and Charlie isn't around, so I can, do it on Charlie's behalf. It's only to his benefit. You can do it whether he's aware or not aware. You can merit for somebody not in his presence. You can do them good even without their knowledge and acquiescence. But you can't do something that has a sort of a negative impact on somebody, even if it's not all negative, even if only one aspect is negative. Only in their presence, only with their knowledge and agreement. So I can't set the Erev Tchumim unless he agrees and is aware. Now, the point is, as Tosa says, that's not because Eruv Tchumim is more machmir. That's just because of the realities that Eruv Tchumim has with it, a trade-off that Eruv Chatzeros does not have. So Tosa says, but there really are trade-offs in both directions. First of all, what this means is, even if I overheard Charlie saying, I'm really looking forward to, going to greet my Rebbe when he comes out, from the east, that even then I can't do it without him knowing, because since there is some loss, even if I know that basically he's interested in it, I need his explicit implicit acquiescence and agreement. So Tosfos says, but there's some loss in the Erev Chatzeros case as well, because I'm actually going into his house and taking some of his bread and using that to contribute to make the Erev. So in Tosfos, really in both cases, there's a gain and a loss. And the fact that we let me do it by Erev Chatzeros and we don't let me do it by Erev Tchumim shows that we are more lenient by Erev Chatzeros. That's how Tosfos reads it. It is a funny proof, and the Gemara could have just said Eruv Tchumim has a D'oraisa component. Anyway, that's why Rav Papa is saying you needed to say we go like Rabbi Yochanan Menuri to emphasize that we're lenient by Eruv even by Eruv Tchumim. Okay, and now the Gemara goes on. Rav Ashi Amar Itzrich. I needed to tell me we rule like Rabbi Yochanan Menuri for the following reason. I would have thought, when is it that we are lenient by Eruv? Maybe by the remnant of an Eruv, meaning that the Eruv was good, and the question is, does it remain good? If it's a question at the outset, should I rule it to be a good Eruv? Maybe we wouldn't be so lenient. Says the Gemara, why would I have thought that you might have been more lenient by the remnant of an Eruv, after it was placed, rather than before it was placed? Not, because we taught in the Mishnah. I'm Rabbi Yossi. When is it that you have a minimum amount of food that has to be contributed when you're first putting down the Eruv? If you made a good Eruv and then the food got, eaten away or something happened to it and there was only a tiny little bit left, so once you're dealing with after it was already good, a few kol shehu, even a small amount. So you see you're more lenient once it was good than you are at the outset. And the only reason they said to do Erev Chatzeros was that the children should not forget. Now, what does that mean? We shouldn't forget what? I mean, what do you mean? The only reason they said? So there's a whole question what this means, but the simple explanation is that it's talking about a particular case where here's your alleyway, and you have three separate courtyards opening into the alleyway. So normally each courtyard would make their own Eruv, and then they'd all make a shituf mavos in the alleyway. But what happens if these courtyards also fed one into the other? They had side doors, right? Yeah, like that picture. And they also all made an Eruv together. So once they're all making an Eruv together, they don't actually really have to make a shituf mavos in the alleyway as well. So that's what he's saying, yes, it's true. In this case, they really wouldn't have to do it, but it's shelo l'shakeach Torah's Erev min hatinokos. We don't want to forget, and therefore in this case we demand it. So it's a parenthetical statement. Anyway, the point being is, I might have thought to apply it after the Eruv was good, and not say you're always lenient before the Eruv is good, because we might make a difference, a distinction.
Them the wrong thing.
No, you don't teach them the wrong thing. No. Yeah, but it's a question about chinuch and habituation. That and it's not only about children. We sort of, based on what we've done in the past, we make we infer certain things, and they might be not incorrect inferences. So if we saw that all the courtyards were carrying in this alleyway and they didn't do a shituf mavos, I might infer you never need to do a shituf mavos. So it makes more sense to always demand a shituf mavos, even in some cases where technically it might not be, because because it's also a question of which misinference is more consequential, is more potentially problematic. So to think I always need it is not as bad as thinking I never need it. Okay, let's continue the Gemara. Rabbi Yaakov, Rabbi Zrika Amru. So this is quite a fascinating digression in the Gemara, talking about general principles of Psak. Yachid b'mokom rabim, kedai hu das yachid lismot b'shas adachak, halach k'divrei mekel be'erev, halach k'divrei mekel be'avel. And now we're going to get to a section of the Gemara, which is, what is the rules when different Tanaim argue with one another? Are there positions we favor one over the other as a general rule? Okay, so here it is. So Rabbi Yaakov and Reb Zeka said, Halach Rabbi Akiva mechavero, will always rule like Rabbi Akiva when he argues with a single opinion, his friend, but not his friends. If it's many against one, we won't. Rabbi Yossi, and we'll rule like Rabbi Yossi mechaverov, even if he disagrees with multiple opinions. Rebbe, and we'll rule like Rabbi Yehuda Nasi, michavero, against a single opinion, his colleague, but not colleagues. Okay, so these are general klali psak. So the Gemara says, Lemai hilchasa. Now, for what purpose are you telling me we rule like them? Meaning, are you saying we absolutely rule like it? Blindly, 100%? So So Rabbi Yasi Amar halacha. We fully rule like it halacha. Rabbi Chia bar Ava Amar matim. We incline that way. Rabbi Yosef Rabbi Chanina Amar nirim. It seems to us that position. Now, what's the difference between incline and seems? So Rashi says one thing. I'll tell you what Tosafos says, which makes, I think, a little bit more sense. Tosafos says, to say we absolutely rule that way, remember, like in the Gemara before, if it said halacha, then the other opinion even stops being a das yachid. So if we say halacha, like from Rabbi Akiva Mechavero, that means if somebody ruled like the opposing position, you would actually have to reverse the psak. The other position becomes completely illegitimate. Matim means, yes, I'll rule like Rabbi Akiva, but the other position remains a legitimate das yachid. Okay? And therefore, if somebody ruled like it, it's a legitimate rule. Nirim is even weaker. Nirim means, this opinion appears more correct, so it should be the one that you should go by, but it's completely legitimate to rule even lechatchila like the other position. So different degrees about how much we're saying this is the absolutely, or, this is the weightier position. Okay, so that's quite fascinating, those three things on a hierarchy of how much does it mean to paskin like one position over the other.
What was the first one?
Halacha, which means that the other position is completely illegitimate. Okay, mati means the other one is legitimate, maybe b'di'eved, b'shas hadchak, and niri means it's really, it seems more correct to pass in one way, but it's completely legitimate to pass in the other as well. All right, so three different interpretations of what it means we rule like this one over that one. Okay. Koloshan Zam Rabbi Yaakov Bar Idi. So Rabbi Yaakov Bar Idi had the following way of saying over different rules of how you paskin. Amar Rabbi Yochanan, Rabbi Meir of Rabbi Yehuda. So he's in the name of Rabbi Yochanan. Rabbi Meir and Rabbi Yehuda. If it's debate of Rabbi Meir and Rabbi Yehuda, halach Rabbi Yehuda. We go like Rabbi Yehuda. Rabbi Yehuda of Rabbi Yossi. If it's Rabbi Yehuda against Rabbi Yossi, remember Rabbi Yossi was the one that we ruled even against multiple opposing positions. Halach Rabbi Yossi. We go like Rabbi Yossi. So Rabbi Yehuda beats Rabbi Meir, and Rabbi Yossi beats Rabbi Yehuda. So therefore, think Sarich Lomar, you don't have to tell me Rabbi Meir Rabbi Yossi, halach Rabbi Yossi. The Rabbi Yossi beats out Rabbi Meir. It's the transitive axiom of inequality. Okay, hashta b'makom Rabbi Yehuda lessa. If Rabbi Meir's position is rejected in the presence of Rabbi Yehuda, b'makom Rabbi Yossi, in the presence of Rabbi Yossi, who wins out over Rabbi Yehuda, mibaya, would there be any question? Okay, I'm Ravasi, said Ravasi, Afanilo made. So, which we're talking about Klal Epsak, I'll tell you the principles I use. I'll tell Rabbi Yossi, Rabbi Shimon, if it's Rabbi Yossi, who was a very weighty one we heard, against Rabbi Shimon, halach Rabbi Yossi, we'd go like Rabbi Yossi. The Amar of Avam, Rabbi Yochanan, Rabbi Yehuda of Rabbi Shimon, how do I know this? Because I figured out from the following. Because we teach that Rabbi Yehuda versus Rabbi Shimon, halach Rabbi Yehuda. Rabbi Yehuda wins out. So Rabbi Yehuda beats Rabbi Shimon. So, and we know that Rabbi Yossi beats Rabbi Yehuda. So, hashta b'mokum Rabbi Yehuda lessa. If Rabbi Shimon's position is rejected in the presence of Rabbi Yehuda, b'mokum Rabbi Yossi mibaya. Is there any question about what it is when he's against Rabbi Yossi? So clearly, using this transitive axiom, we know that Rabbi Yossi beats out Rabbi Shimon. Now, Rabbi Yehuda beats out two positions. The weakest two positions that have been put on this list are Rabbi Meir and Rabbi Shimon. So now the Gemara says, so ibayahu. They ask Rabbi Meir, Rabbi Shimon. Let's say it's Rabbi Meir against Rabbi Shimon. What would we say? Teku. That's what we know. We don't know. Now the Gemara begins to challenge this idea that we always go by the following lineup. Like these rules always apply. And it's going to say, what are you talking about? There are times we paskin, one of these against the other. So we'll read one example about this, and we'll stop with that for today. So the Gemara says like this. Amar Rav Mashasha, said Rav Mashasha, less nulani klali. We don't hold of these rules. Mina leilu Rav Mashasha. Where does Rav Mashasha get that these rules are really not how we paskin by? Ilim hatnan, because we taught in the Mishnah. Reb Shimon Omer, based on our Mishnah. Lemad davar domeh. What is this case like when people's four amot overlap with one another? Legimel chatzeros haptuchos lezu, ptuchos l'shut harabim. The three courtyards that they open to one another and they open to the street. Irbu shtayim hachitzonim imim ta'it. If 1 and 2 made an Eruv and 2 and 3 made an Eruv, then everybody overlaps in 2. He mutarsi mahem, so 2 can carry with 1 and 3. Vehem mutarsi ma, 1 and 3 can carry with 2. And 1 and 3 are usher one against the other. Okay, so that we saw in the Mishnah, but that was only said in the name of Rabbi Shimon. The Amar of Chama Bar Goria, Amar Rav, halach Rabbi Shimon. We rule like Rabbi Shimon. Oh, it's all very nice. Where's the opposing position? So the Gemara says, Uman Paligalei. Who's the opposing position? Rabbi Yehuda. Now, this is very strange. We didn't see an opposing position in our Mishnah. How do you even know it's Rabbi Yehuda? So Rashi and Tosfos try to figure out how the Gemara knows it's Rabbi Yehuda. But for our purposes, we'll accept that the Gemara understands that this is a Rabbi Shimon position, and Rabbi Yehuda disagrees, and we rule like Rabbi Shimon. Now, we just got through saying Rabbi Shimon versus Rabbi Yehuda. We rule like Rabbi Yehuda. So you see that these rules aren't true. So the Gemara says, "V'ha Marta Rabbi Yehuda, Rabbi Shimon, alach Rabbi Yehuda." Didn't you tell me we're all supposed to go like Rabbi Yehuda? Elav Shema Mina. So come, you can see from this, says Rav Misharsha, less new. These rules aren't true. We don't go by them. And here the Gemara makes a very important qualification about what does it mean to go by these rules, and we'll end with this for today. So the Gemara says, "Umay kusha." Why is that a challenge? Dilma heicha de itmar itmar, heicha de lo itmar. Meaning, no. When we say these rules, it doesn't mean we never paskin the other position. It means if it was said we paskin A over B in a particular case, fine. It's always possible in any particular case we'll rule with one opinion as opposed to the other. The principle about these the point of these klolim is heicha de lo itmar, where we don't know how to paskin. We don't have a tradition who was right. It's not clear who was right. When you don't know how to paskin, you go by these rules. But if it was said which position we go by, now these rules are 100% of the time. They're rules you use when you don't know how to paskin and when there isn't evidence about how you paskin. Okay, so we'll see more about that tomorrow.